cool thing I learned from my guest today, neuroscientist Andrea Luppi, about this experiment. So monkeys were under anesthesia, and scientists, they stimulated certain parts of their brain and brought them back to the state of consciousness. So it tells us that neuroscientists are figuring out how to manipulate consciousness. And in general, this conversation today, we mostly covered what we can learn about consciousness from psychedelics, from state of coma and anesthesia. And closer to the end of this conversation, we discussed with Andrea emergence of consciousness in AI systems and his take on it as a neuroscientist. So I hope you enjoy this conversation. What I understood is that if we try to understand like how consciousness works under anesthesia, it might tell us a lot about the consciousness itself, because like this is very kind of unique situation, unique environment. Like we intentionally make that person doesn't feel pain, like, and doesn't have like, you know, kind of awareness, but still the consciousness is still there, right? Like it's not like a dead person. It's there, there's still life happening. There's still all the functions happening, and we still can claim that that person it's a conscious being, even it's they're like not aware of their surroundings and they don't know what's happening. I'm just like wondering if you could maybe, based on your research and your understanding, like what's really happening with a person under anesthesia.
Maybe it's helpful if I touch a bit on the background that you were mentioning. You know, why would we study anesthesia, right? And as you said, I am a philosopher by training, and that philosophy and psychology were hand in hand. And I found that they were complementing each other very well, because you can. I think the philosophical training has been very helpful in trying to identify, you know, the crux of the matter, what's really fundamental to the questions that are driving this kind of research, and what instead is more specific. And so what I mean is, the reason we care about anesthesia is, of course, because it has clinical applications, and it's probably one of the greatest discoveries of modern medicine. A lot of what we can do right now medically, we could not do without anesthesia, with a simple knock on the head, effectively. So anesthetics are wonderful clinically, but also they have this very unique property, which you were describing earlier, that is, the person is unconscious, or the animal for that matter, but not because they're dead. It's very easy, in a sense, trivially easy, to suppress consciousness because brains are fragile. And if the person dies, if there is some irreversible damage, you know, death happens and the person is no longer conscious. The point of anesthesia is that the brain is intact. It's a purely functional change. And once the anesthetic wears off, consciousness comes back. So we can look at consciousness in its presence or absence, while keeping everything else in the brain, at least in how it's structured, the same. The neurons are still alive. And that is really important, because anesthesia then occupies this very interesting intersection between two other states. On one hand, you have a coma or a vegetative state, unresponsive wakefulness syndrome, as it's now called, which is unconsciousness that is chronic. It's permanent. We don't know how to reverse it. We would like to know how to reverse it. We're working on it, but right now we don't.
Can you elaborate on this?
For example, there are patients who may have a stroke, or they may have suffered from hypoxia, or they may have suffered from some traumatic brain injury. So maybe a car accident, motorcycle accident. And then they have a brain lesion. Parts of the brain are not working anymore, or the brain is deformed, or part of the tissue is dead. And the result is that they are chronically unconscious. So they're not waking up. They might have, for example, sometimes their eyes will be open, at some other points they're not, but they are defined as being in unresponsive wakefulness. So they have quote unquote sleep-wake cycles, in the sense that eyes open and close, but they're not responsive. If you ask them, can you squeeze my hand? Or if you ask them, can you follow my finger with your gaze? They do not do that in any reliable manner. So they're chronically unconscious, and there's currently no foolproof therapy for bringing them back. A lot of people are working to help bringing them back, but right now recovery is the prognosis is usually fairly bad for these kind of patients. So they are unconscious in a way that is induced externally, but permanent or close to permanent. And then on the other hand, and so the intersection there is that anesthesia is also induced externally. It's not something that would happen spontaneously to the body. But what would happen spontaneously to the body, of course, is sleep. We all, every day, fall asleep, or every night rather, and then spend some time unconscious and then eventually recover spontaneously that consciousness. So that means that brains are naturally capable of unconsciousness. In fact, you die if you don't sleep for long enough. But that's not something that we're inducing externally, and that means it's difficult or more difficult to study in a lab. And anesthesia is similar to sleep in the sense that neither of them causes any brain damage. The brain is structurally intact. But with anesthesia, you can study that. You can control how deep the anesthesia is. You can bring someone back. And so anesthesia is not just useful clinically, is my point. It's also a very powerful tool for studying consciousness experimentally in the lab. And the way that we tend to do that as neuroscientists is, for example, we use a lot functional MRI, which is a non-invasive method for scanning the brain. So we acquire images very rapidly, about once every second or once every other second, of the entire brain. And then we can tell where there is more or less blood and how much oxygen there is in that blood. And that lets us know effectively how much activity there is over time in each part of the region or in each part of the brain. Sometimes a region will be a bit more active and then it's a bit less active. And we can track them all at the same time and then keep going over time. So this is the usual setup. And then you just compare brain under anesthesia and brain during awake or maybe after you've recovered from anesthesia. And the question then is, what are those differences, right? And so a lot of my work is about finding those differences. And part of the problem there is that this is not something that I knew before I started, but it turns out there's not just one anesthetic. There's a lot of different drugs that are classified as anesthetics, that they will suppress consciousness, suppress behavior, and you can use them for surgery, but they act on different molecules. They act on different receptors. They have ultimately different effects on physiology, even beyond consciousness, like breathing or heart rate and so on. And so a lot of our work is not just looking at how one particular anesthetic works, because if you're looking at just one particular anesthetic, you always have the confound of, is this the effect of this anesthetic specifically, or is this the effect of loss of consciousness? And if you're only ever looking at one, you cannot take them apart. So instead, we look at a lot of different anesthetics, even quite different from the molecular point of view. And then we try to see what's common across all of them.
Are there any findings?
Yes, there are. And one of the main things is a lot of these findings are very similar to what happens to the brain in a coma or a vegetative state. Even though anesthesia and the coma come from completely different pathways. Coma comes from lesions in different parts of the brain. Anesthesia, no lesion, brain is intact, and yet you find similarities. And one of these similarities, which is not my work, I've contributed to it, but it was found about a decade ago, so well before I started working in this, is you can think a bit of the brain as, you can think of the brain as a network, right? So different parts of the brain are connected by effectively white matter pathways. You can think of them as the roads in the brain, really. And not every region is directly connected to every other. That would require, that would not be possible. It wouldn't fit inside the skull. Some regions are connected and some regions are connected indirectly. So you can go from A to B and from B to C, and therefore A can send information to C, even though they're not directly physically connected. They need the intermediary of B. What these people found, and it's a very prominent group in Paris with Hakosid and Bardfeld were some of the main authors when Stan Dehaene. What they were finding is, this was in monkeys, but later on they generalized the same thing to humans. In the awake brain, there's a lot of communication between regions that are not directly connected. So A and C, from that previous example, they're not directly connected, but they're still talking a lot, which the functional MRI will be able to pick up, because basically their activity is in sync. One of them is more active at this point, the other one is also more active, and they go like this. More active, less active together. In the anesthetized brain, that does not happen anymore. So in the anesthetized brain, basically regions only talk to their direct neighbors. Two regions are not physically connected. It's much more difficult for them to be able to talk. Sometimes it happens, but rarely. It's much more difficult. So in a way, the way that we tend to call it is this structure-function coupling. In anesthesia, structure-function coupling is very tight. There's a very strong constraint of structure on function. Whereas in the awake brain, that constraint is much looser. The coupling is much looser, and so the function is more free to diverge from the structure and occupy different configurations. Because if you think about it, in the course of even a few seconds, your brain might go from being interested to being maybe distracted for a moment. Then you go back and then you're paying attention to what I'm saying. Then you have a memory of one time that you had anesthesia yourself. And then you go back to thinking, maybe I wish I'd invited a different guest, and hopefully then I regain your attention, right? So all of that requires different parts of the brain to constantly make new interactions with each other, because you have one region that is responsible for memory that's not the same that's responsible for attention. And so at some point they're not talking, but then you have the memory and then the language region. I say the word anesthesia, that triggers your memory region. And so those two now are talking. And then when you're bored, that's a different, and the attention regions are, deactivating and so on. So there's a lot of different possible interactions that need to happen.
On physiological level, it's like different pathways?
Yes. So effectively, what we do is we can image these brain networks, the structural ones, also non-invasively, or in the monkeys, even invasively to get more precision. And what we find is that just you can superimpose them, basically, the functional and the structural one. And when you are unconscious, the superposition is very good. And when you are conscious, then all of a sudden they're not very superimposed anymore. And that's because those indirect paths that go from A to B to C and maybe even to D, all of a sudden are starting to be used a lot more and a lot more dynamically. So at some point it's one path that is active, and then next couple of seconds it's a different one.
Is it under anesthesia?
Under anesthesia, it's less dynamic. Under anesthesia, it's more constrained, stronger coupling, less dynamic. When you're awake, much more dynamic, much richer repertoire of possible configuration.
From physiology perspective, like is it like the path, like more active pathways that are forming, like the communication between like neurons, like what on physiological level, like when you say like different regions are like more actively talking to each other, what's happening on the physiological level?
That's a bit more complicated to look into, because we are working with functional MRI, which is non-invasive. So it's we're not really able to look into and say how active is the neuron here. So instead, we're getting a more macroscopic picture, effectively. The advantage is that we can see all of the regions at the same time, whereas if we were sticking an electrode in one particular place, we would know about that place, but not any of the others. What we do know is that when you look at EEG, which is much faster, like it has a much higher temporal resolution than functional MRI, typically you see that the EEG slows down. But those are different modalities that address different questions.
So basically what we found out is that there's less activity, like more constraints, like only like direct communication, no indirect communication, or like very rarely that indirect communication is happening. What that tells us about consciousness itself?
So just one tiny comment there. It's not less activity necessarily. It's more about connectivity. So the activity could even be the same, but it's where it happens is different. It's not how much of it there is.
The scope, yeah, understood. It's the level of activity is the same, but the map, the scale is much.
Yeah, it happens in different places at different times. Whereas before, it might happen more the regions that have activity at the same time. What matters is which regions have activity at the same time. There's many more combinations of that you can see in the conscious brain. And we think this is relevant for consciousness in the following sense, that and this is why I was making the example of you being interested and bored and having a lot of thoughts. Like, in order for your brain to have a rich, interesting, subjective experience, If we think that subjective experience consciousness comes from the brain, and as a neuroscientist, I think that that's the case, so I'm not a dualist. If you think that, then the more experiences you have, the more rich your experience, that has to be reflected in how different parts of the brain talk to each other. If presumably if two parts of the brain that are deputized to different functions, if they're never able to talk, then those functions can never interact, right? If your language regions and your memory regions were unable to interact, then you would not be able to have a memory triggered by a word. But even though maybe they're not necessarily connected, this can still happen because they're able to interact indirectly. And this is just, I'm just picking those two at random, but it could be any of the others. So the conscious brain is able to make a lot more of those connections on the fly. So these are functional connections. It's not the case that you have more physical connections springing up. That would not be plausible. It's how you use the physical connections that you'd have. And the conscious brain uses in such a way that you can make a lot of different configurations happen. A lot of different regions can all of a sudden talk to each other and then stop talking when that's not relevant anymore. That does not happen anymore when you're unconscious. When you're unconscious, basically there's only very minimal local traffic between the regions, and that is only because there's a direct path between them. In some sense, richness of experience has to map onto the richness of the connectivity that can happen in a brain, the configurations that the brain can take.
Do we understand, is modern, our knowledge about anesthesia allows us to understand how exactly on physiological level it affects brain, or it's still we're still trying to understand how exactly it affects on physical level the brain, that it causes these changes?
In a sense, both. We have a fairly good understanding at some levels, especially the molecular levels. So we know very well which anesthetic molecule binds to which receptors on, say, the surface of a cell. And we know which anesthetics will, for example, increase the blood flow and increase heart rate and respiration or suppress it. What we are still working on, and some of my work is in that direction, is trying to understand how that microscale knowledge maps onto the macro scale effects at the level of this, what I was describing earlier, this network level change. And part of the reason is that the same kind of big scale changes that I was describing, we observe them with the usual kinds of anesthetics that we would get during a surgery. We also observe them in patients with a disorder of consciousness, even though there it's a completely different mechanism because it's due to a lesion. But we also observe them with different anesthetics that bind to different receptors at the micro scale. So somehow you have different molecules binding to different receptors on the cell, and yet sometimes even different cells entirely are the preferred targets, and yet somehow they manage to exert the same large-scale effects. So there is a convergence, and that's what we're still working on and trying to figure out.
Why this convergence is happening?
Yes, and so some of the work takes the form of comparing the effects of different anesthetics so that you can see how similar are they. Some of the work takes the form of trying to reverse this effect. So, for example, some of our colleagues in Paris, they're working with non-human primates, and they found that you can reverse this effect and reawaken a monkey from anesthesia during the anesthesia itself by stimulating a very small region deep inside the brain.
I actually wanted to ask you about this. This is really fascinated me. That you can just stimulate this region and all of a sudden all the effects of anesthesia, they're just wiped out.
Yeah.
Is that correct?
That's been found by at least 3 different groups, more or less independently. One of them who I collaborate with is this group in Paris. Bashir Jaraya is the main author. The group leader. And the difference is that they were also scanning the monkey with functional MRI at the same time. So they were able to show that this effect that I was describing of the brain under anesthesia, structural function coupling becoming stronger, as soon as you start stimulating this particular region, the monkey wakes up, it opens its eyes, it's fully awake, and the structural function coupling goes back to being very interesting and diverse. So it's reversing not just the behavioral effect of anesthesia, the monkey is awake, but also the neural effect. So that gives us a much stronger confidence that that's something real, that there is an association between those two, the behavior and what's happening in the brain. And they show that this is very specific to that particular part, because the thalamus is a part of the brain, but they're not just stimulating the entire thalamus. They're stimulating a nucleus within the thalamus, the central median nucleus. And if you stimulate just another one nearby, called the ventrolateral nucleus, nothing happens. So it's super specific. Some of my recent work, I had the same question. Why is this happening? How is this happening? And so some of my recent work was that was published a couple of weeks ago about having a computational model of this effect. So why is this happening? One thing that you can do is you can effectively try to simulate the effect in a computer model. So you put together, for example, this is how my regions in the monkey brain are connected. We know how they are connected. And then you have a model of how regions behave on a, of course, it's a simplified model, but it reproduces the activity that we see from functional MRI reasonably well. And then you can say, what happens if now I simulate anesthesia? And that we know how to do. For example, you can increase the inhibition. The drug, the specific anesthetic that they were using is propofol. And we and others know that both at the micro scale, but also the macro scale, you can think of it as increasing inhibition. So it prevents neurons from firing. So it overall less activity. And then you can say, in this particular context, less activity. And then you can say, what if I simulate in the model the stimulation of this region or that region? So the one that works or the one that don't. And we see that they have different effects. And that's because of how they're connected to the rest of the brain. So the region that has a better effect, that looks like in the model it would restore consciousness, which is what it does in the real monkey brain, that one has a, if you will, a more interesting pattern of connectivity to the rest of the brain. So it's better able to counteract the effects of the drug. And so you can have this local controller of the global state of consciousness by stimulating that one region, and then you can suppress consciousness with the drug. So now we are in a very interesting position where until a few years ago, we knew how to suppress consciousness. We had a lot of different drugs that can do that, but we didn't know how to bring it back.
Now we start understanding how to bring it back by stimulating that nucleus in the thalamus.
And there are other works that are using, for example, different drugs to try and achieve the same effect. So it's not perhaps the only way, but it is a way that at least in the monkey works very well. And the good thing about that specific method is that part of the brain is a very old part of the brain, and it's very similar in the human brain and in the monkey brain. So the hope is that it might work for the human brain.
I forgot to look up where thalamus is. Where is it located?
It's very deep, sort of in the center of the brain, pretty much.
It's in the center of the brain. Okay. Could it be that it's kind of like a switch off and switch on? That particular part inside the brain, that if you stimulate it, could it be like it's without anesthetic, could you make someone unconscious and then bring consciousness back if you stimulate that particular nucleus? It's kind of like, switch on, switch off, I don't know. Maybe it's like a stupid question, but I just wanted to explore with you.
No, not at all. And in fact, I think one of those two other groups that found the same effect, so they also stimulated that same part and they found that it reawakens the monkey from anesthesia. One of them, I think, was finding that you can have an anesthesia-like effect with a particular stimulation protocol. I'm not sure about the details, so I don't want to conjecture too much, but that is definitely something that they were looking at, and I think they did find something on that front. And there are other reports in the literature of other regions that, when stimulated, can induce a temporary loss of consciousness. One of them is a region near the insula, whose name is the insula. Another region sometimes is the precuneus, where people have, a colleague of mine has done some stimulation there, beautiful work from Stanford. So the important point I want to make is that region in the brain need not be the only one that can reawaken from anesthesia. It's the only one that we know for sure right now, but there could be others. And there's definitely others that have at least been reported to suppress consciousness when stimulated. So it's not a one-to-one mapping. It's probably a many-to-many mapping. There are drugs that are being trialed for reversing the effects of anesthesia or reversing the effect of coma, for example, which is ultimately the goal. But I do think it's very exciting having so much convergence on that one region. And there's been reports of that also working in humans. There was an older work in patients with a disorder of consciousness. So that's very exciting. I think one of the most exciting things to happen in the last 5 years.
I guess it's not clear, like if we're talking about like without anesthetic, sort of turning off consciousness. I guess there's still like lots of unclarity, right? It's still like ongoing research. Is it possible to turn off consciousness without anesthetic if we stimulate those parts of brain?
In a sense, I mean, consciousness turns off spontaneously with sleep, right? So we're not talking about that. It can also turn off permanently if you have a lesion in some parts of the brain. But I think what you're getting at is a temporary disruption of consciousness. So the problem is that's only ever been reported in patients, because to do that kind of stimulation, usually it's someone who needs to have surgery, like open skull surgery. And so the surgeon is trying to stimulate, but usually for epilepsy, for example. A surgeon is trying to stimulate a particular part of the brain to see what happens here. And then the person goes unconscious. And then you stop the stimulation, the person comes back. And that's how you find out. Some of those are anecdotal reports. So there's only 1 or 2 reports in the literature. Others, like this precuneus that I was mentioning, that's a bit more established. But again, it's only in patients. There's a complication there. And of course, it requires opening up the skull. So it's not something that, for example, we use right now. Yeah.
When we talk about consciousness, like there are like different definitions of consciousness could be, like, and there are different theories of consciousness. What we're talking here is that like this specific function of brain that diminishes under certain conditions, right?
Let me just decouple the two of them a little bit. So the way that I talk about consciousness is, and you're exactly right, there's a lot of different definitions, a lot of different theories. I like to use what is called an operational definition. So consciousness is, for me, very broadly speaking, that you lose when you fall into dreamless sleep or anesthesia and recover when you wake up. So I'm not defining what it is, I'm sort of finding a way of pointing it out to you, right? It's not my invention. This is just a widely used one in the literature, precisely because it avoids a bit of some of the philosophical nuances and perils that you can have. Different people can differ, but so long as we know what we're talking about, then it's fine. And I should be clear that, at least in the way that I use it and in my work, we assume that it's not just human specific, that at the very least, monkeys and presumably mice have something that is similar to that. So that is suppressed by anesthesia. Then when we look at the brain, what we're looking at, for example, that structure function coupling that I was telling you about, other signatures that we can talk about, these are what we call signatures. It's something that we're trying to find something that tracks the presence of consciousness. So that goes away when consciousness goes away, and then ideally comes back when consciousness comes back. Because if it goes away and then stays away, it's not what we're looking for. And so that's why we do this, comparing anesthesia with one drug or with another drug, comparing anesthesia with disorders of consciousness, comparing anesthesia in humans and in other species, like the monkey, trying to see if our signature comes back when the monkey is reawakened, despite the presence of the anesthetic. It's trying to put a stress test on these signatures to see which signatures are truly robust and which ones not so much. And the one that I was describing to you is one of the most robust, because we see it in different species, different anesthetics. It comes back when the monkey wakes up. There are others too, and some of those we've been working on or developed ourselves. Others are from other people. I would not say that consciousness just is the same as having an interesting structure-function relationship. It's not only that, and it Maybe there are cases where those two things don't go together anymore. I don't know of them, but maybe there are. So I'm not saying that there is an identity there. All I'm saying is, in a way, is this more modest claim, the structure function coupling that's happening in your brain seems to tell us something about your state of consciousness. It seems to track at least something that's going on in your consciousness.
Yeah, so it's basically at least one component that we're currently observing and conducting experiments, but there could be more things involved in that process. What actually makes someone conscious and have conscious experience.
Exactly. And in some cases, it might happen that relationship breaks down. Then maybe in some interesting state, that relationship is not there anymore. So I can give you an interesting example here. So one of those drugs that I was mentioning that is very different ways of anesthetizing someone is ketamine. Now, at low doses, ketamine acts a bit like a psychedelic. At high doses, ketamine is called an anesthetic because the person becomes unresponsive. So usually the way that we operationalize consciousness is we check whether someone is responsive or not. So when they are unresponsive, that's taken as our proxy for loss of consciousness. And we know very well that it is an imperfect proxy, but it's also the one that is most used clinically. That's the one that surgeons use when you're being put to sleep for a surgery. That's the one that clinicians use to assess a coma, vegetative state. So it's a useful one, even though we know that sometimes you can be unresponsive but still conscious.
Yeah, and there are reported cases, right, of people who undergoing through surgery being conscious.
Exactly. But there are also cases that are a bit more intermediate. So, for example, the reason I'm bringing up ketamine is because during a high dose of ketamine, you will be unresponsive. You might not feel pain. You can be operated on even. So you're not behaviorally responsive. And you don't know what is happening around you. You're disconnected from the environment, but you are still conscious in the sense that you have very vivid dreams, for example. So those dreams are not. So there is two distinctions to be made. There is, you could be conscious and connected to the environment. So that's what you and I are right now. Or you could be conscious but disconnected, which is what happens during dreams. And it's also what happens during the dreams induced by ketamine. So you're not dreaming about, I'm in an operating theater. You might be dreaming about, I'm flying over a city. When we scanned people who are under, our colleagues in Belgium scanned people who were under the effects of a high dose of ketamine. And then they sent us the data and we analyzed them to look for the structure function coupling. And we didn't find it. We didn't find the signature of anesthesia that we were expecting. We would have thought if they're unconscious, then we should see that structure function coupling becoming tighter, like we always see. And we were very confused with why is this happening? And then my very bright student had the thought of, well, let's look at what the reports were from these people. And it's a small study. They only had 8 people because, of course, it's difficult to run this kind of study. And each and every one of them had reported very vivid dreams. One of them reported flying over a city. That's why I made that example. Another one reported sinking into the scanner. So they were all conscious. There was some subjective experience, but it was completely detached from reality. But the presence of that subjective experience was enough to sustain that structure function coupling, right? So being unresponsive is not the same. And the signature that I'm talking about tracks what's happening in your mind, not what's happening with your body. It tracks whether you're conscious, not whether you're responsive, which sometimes can be dissociated.
Images of their MRI were very different from what you observe from people under anesthesia. They didn't experience pain. They didn't experience anything. So you can just really conduct surgery on them under ketamine. But at the same time, the brain activity, that structural brain activity was the same as conscious person or similar.
Well, not quite the same. So it wasn't the same. So you could tell that there was something strange going on. In fact, it looked a bit like a psychedelic. So you could tell that there was something strange going on, but it wasn't lack of consciousness.
What I'm curious about, the difference between conscious mind in under like normal circumstances, and that conscious mind activity under like that ketamine? Was it that structural like behavior, was it, you said it was different, but was it like, did it make like more these connections, more connections between like distinct parts of brain? Like what the alterations were under ketamine compared to like when you're just like in a normal state?
Basically, the alterations were going in the opposite way as you normally see with anesthesia. With normal anesthesia, you see the loss of structure function decoupling, so structure and function become more similar. When you recover from anesthesia, they go back to being a bit different. Under ketamine, you see the same thing that you see with psychedelics like LSD or psilocybin. So the difference increases. The function all of a sudden becomes very different from the structure. So even regions that normally would almost never talk to each other, all of a sudden start talking a lot. So it's literally, you have these two dimensions. On one hand, you have what happens with anesthesia and disorders of consciousness. Then you have something in the middle, a sort of maybe optimal level of structure function relationship. And then you have the other extreme where those are very decoupled instead of being very coupled. And then in that state, in the very decoupled state, people are still conscious, because under ketamine, as proved by these dreams, you're still conscious. Under LSD, you're still conscious. But it's a different state of consciousness.
Is it that effect only under ketamine? Are there like any studies on, like with, psilocybin or like LSD, other psychedelics? Is it like generalizable across psychedelics, or it's like a property of ketamine?
We did those studies. So we know that exactly the same thing as you see with that high dose of ketamine, you see with a lower dose of ketamine, which has psychedelic-like effects. You see that with LSD. We did that study. My colleague Selene Atasoy was the first one to report that. I showed the same thing in a different method for structure-function coupling. Psilocybin that you're mentioning, we also showed that. We showed that with DMT. So just like there are a lot of different anesthetics, and they all seem to have the same effect of increasing structure-function coupling, in the same way there are a lot of psychedelics, and a lot of them have this effect of decreasing structure-function coupling. So like your function and structure become decoupled from each other a lot. So yeah, very generalizable, even though they also have different molecular mechanisms from each other. So it's not about the specific molecule, it's about the downstream effects.
But is it has the same effect as a ketamine in the sense that, again, you can conduct like surgery on a person if it's property of ketamine, right? Like it becomes like you don't experience any pain.
Among them, ketamine is the only one that I know of that shares these anesthetic-like effect on behavior, where at a high you can operate on someone, with the psychedelic-like, in a sense, dissociation from reality, and the psychedelic-like effect like ego dissolution, hallucinations, etc. Ketamine is, in a sense, the intersection between the world of anesthetics, which usually make you unresponsive but also unconscious, and the work of psychedelics, which usually don't make you unresponsive.
And what, like seeing how the psychedelics affect human brain, like, do you have any like insights or like new understanding about like human consciousness?
So the one thing that we've done, well, more than one, but one thing that we have done is really forming a bit of filling up this space of the relationship between brain and mind. So before we knew a lot, but one of the things that we didn't know is how that structure-function relationship tracks what's going on in your mind. And now, broadly speaking, we can tell that your structure-function relationship, if it's too low, you're likely to be unconscious. And if it's too high, you're likely to be in an altered state. So there's sort of a one-dimensional continuum there. The problem is, and so because of that, there are other properties that go together. Usually when you're unconscious, brain activity is simpler. It's less complex. And then you have maybe an optimal complexity when you're conscious. And when you're under psychedelics, that complexity tends to increase even more. And it might be too much. There's a bit too much entropy, too much disorder in the brain. So brains need balance in a lot of things. And one of the balances that they need is excitation and inhibition, and it looks like anesthesia often increases that inhibition. But one of the other ways that brains need balance is between order and chaos, in a sense. Like, you don't want a state that is too ordered where nothing ever happens. Well, that's a bit like what we're seeing in this fixed structure function coupling with anesthesia and maybe a coma as well. It's too orderly, nothing is ever changing. So you can have the richness of experience of consciousness. But on the other hand, if you have too much of that decoupling, too complex activity where everything is happening all together and regions that never would talk all of a sudden talk and you start having hallucinations, that's a psychedelic case. So there are some people who are thinking maybe one could try to use psychedelics to wake up someone from a coma. And the rationale there is, if the coma, in a sense, it's got too little chaos. The psychedelic is a way of bringing more chaos into the brain. Maybe they can sort of cancel each other out and you're going to get...
Did they do this experiment?
Yes, actually. There's a few clinical trials who are now openly available, like they're ongoing. And some of them, for example, with ketamine, I think one of them. The only results right now are very, very preliminary. I think there's only one case report where it looks like it's having some effect on the brain, but not necessarily on the behavior. So the patient doesn't look like they're actually waking up. But it's going to be important to have a lot more data for this. So I think it's very good that this is happening, because we're going to be able to get the data to see whether it works or not. One possible problem there is that it's not just one dimension that the brain works. There's many things that govern how brains work. One of them is this balance of order and chaos, but there are other kinds of perturbations, or rather other ways of looking at the brain, basically, where instead you see that anesthesia and psychedelics and a coma, they all have similar effects. So one of the things that you need is a balance, say, between integration and segregation. That's some of the other theories of consciousness talk about this balance. That's also important. Roughly speaking, you don't want a case where nobody talks to each other, because brains need to process information. If regions don't talk to each other, how can they process information, right? They need to have some interaction. But you also don't want to find yourself in a situation where every brain region tries to talk to every other brain region at the same time all at once, because that would be incredibly chaotic and nothing would get done. So you need something in the middle. And it looks like, depending on how you look at this, how you operationalize this, anesthetics, psychedelics, and coma, disorders of consciousness, they all have the same effect. So it's more than one-dimensional. One lens, the lens of order and chaos, will tell you they're opposite. But the lens of disintegration and segregation might actually tell you, no, they're the same. And so you need to take both perspectives into account. And that's why maybe it's not guaranteed that psychedelics as a treatment for disorders of consciousness might work. It's anybody's guess which one of them will prevail. And maybe that's why the one case study where there is showing the expected effect on the brain, but not the expected effect on behavior, because there's more things that govern that. And it goes without saying, but brains are very complex. So it's difficult to reduce anything in the brain to one dimensional axis. Usually there's more things that change whenever you try to change anything.
After studying, brain so many years, what fascinates you the most about human brain?
In a sense, it's not even about the human brain, really. So a lot of what I'm doing now is expanding beyond the human brain and trying to look at the brains of monkeys, mice, even fish, or even worms sometimes. So some of the work that we've been doing now is looking how similar is anesthesia in a worm and in all of those other species I mentioned, fish, mouse, human, monkey. But anesthesia is super conserved. So the same drug that puts you or me to sleep will also work on a worm or a mouse or a monkey. And so some of the things we're finding now is that the same effects that anesthesia will have on a single neuron in that tiny, tiny microscopic worm, it also has on an entire brain region in a human or a monkey. So some of this is very conserved. And I'm really interested in the dichotomy between what is conserved across very different nervous systems. Worms don't really have a brain. They have a very tiny nervous system. Some things are super conserved, which is interesting because it means it's something very fundamental that's going on and makes the brain a brain. And then what's unique about the human brain specifically. So a lot of my earlier work was comparing the human and the monkey brain. and trying to see what makes the human brain special in some sense. And I think it's trying to find those two, what's really, really important, and then what the human brain has on top of that really important stuff.
Did you find out?
We did find out a fair amount of both, yes. The fundamental stuff, we're finding out what it is about anesthesia specifically. But I can tell you a bit about what makes the human brain special. So I was mentioning earlier that you need this, as a brain, brains need a balance of integration and segregation, right? And this is also very fundamental, not just to theories of consciousness, many prominent theories of consciousness talk about it, but also the theory of cognition in general. It's a sensible principle to organize a system effectively. You want to balance those two. And a few years back, some colleagues of mine came up with a way of measuring this balance, this coexistence of integration and segregation. Because it's not, in their eyes, it's not necessary that the two of them have exactly the same value. They don't need to be in balance, but both of them need to be present. The way to think about it is that it's this measure from information theory that they call synergy, which means working together. And that's exactly what you should have. And the idea is you don't want to be a system where the different regions of the brain do completely different things that are unrelated to each other and they never interact. You also don't want to be in a system where every single region is exactly in lockstep with each other. They all do exactly the same thing at the same time. That's what's happening with an epileptic seizure, where there's just complete synchronization across the entire brain, so no new information can get processed, because you get a stimulus and that's just completely ignored because everything is doing exactly the same thing over time. You need some version of both. You need different regions to have different information. So that's the segregation part, differentiation. And then you want that information to come together at some point and get integrated so that the result is informed by what was happening before. And synergy is a mathematical way of capturing that. And what we found is that this synergy is not distributed equally in the human brain. So we found a way to quantify the synergy from those functional MRI scans that I was describing earlier, this time in awake people. And then what we found is it's not the same everywhere. There are some parts of the brain that have more synergy than others. And that's interesting, we think, because those parts of the brain are not random. It's not like a salt and pepper situation where, oh, here's a bit more, here's a bit less, and kind of that would be mysterious, but in a not interesting way. But what we find is that the parts of the human brain that have the most synergy are the ones that control, in a sense, the most human-specific abilities, like working memory or social cognition. Humans are a very social species, we interact a lot. And those regions are also the ones that have expanded the most in the human brain over the course of evolution. So what I mean is human brains are larger than the brains of, say, macaques or chimpanzees. Like chimpanzees are closest evolutionary relative. The human brain is larger than theirs, but not every part is equally larger. So it's not just you took the chimpanzee brain and you make it like 1.5 times larger and you get a human brain. It's not like that. Some parts have stayed almost the same and other parts have expanded a lot. And those parts that have expanded a lot, many of them are right here in the prefrontal cortex. Mm-hmm. And they are the ones where you see the most synergy. So it looks like the human brain has invested more. When it decided, I'm anthropomorphizing here a little bit, but if I'm allowed, then where the human brain has decided to invest the most in its expansion, it's decided to invest the most in synergy. And I don't mean invest, because expansion is very costly metabolically. And the regions that have the most synergy are also some of the most costly from a metabolic perspective. So it was a real investment, but looks like it's paid off because humans have gone to the moon and chimpanzees have not. And interestingly enough, those regions are also where you find most human-specific genes, for example. And that's also what you lose when you become unconscious.
You're losing that synergy.
Yes. So the paper that we just published a couple of weeks ago, it's looking at something. It's not exactly synergy, but includes synergy as a part of it. It's called integrated information. It's inspired by these theories of consciousness, but its main component is synergy. and you very reliably see when you're unconscious, you lose synergy. Not just humans, mice also lose synergy when they're unconscious, when they're under anesthesia. Monkeys also lose synergy when they're under anesthesia. When you do that thalamic stimulation to wake up the monkey, the synergy goes back up. Tracking consciousness very well. That's the other measure that I was mentioning earlier. So there is some relationship there, but it's not a human-specific phenomenon, the presence of synergy, but the human have more than those other monkeys or chimpanzees.
When I was thinking about, what the consciousness, and like you mentioned that you're doing your work across different species, like in worms, there are people who decide which species to treat as sentient, which species treat not sentient because they have less neurons. Like this is like really a little bit like, to me it's like strange, like how you can decide like to treat like worm terribly if it has like less neurons and think that it's not conscious. But I'm wondering how further we can go to like more and more and more and more primitive like species to see if they have also like this response on anesthesia, and maybe go even further and see like plants, like trees, like other organic like matters, see if they also have certain response on anesthesia, and that also would give us certain signal, right, on that consciousness matter.
It is very interesting because there's a very beautiful paper titled From Paramecium to Primate. So Paramecium is a unicellular organism, and I think those are also subjected to anesthesia. So anesthesia seems to be something extremely fundamental. And there they don't even have a nervous system because they literally have just one cell. There is some report that some plants seem to be sensitive to anesthetic molecules as well. Like it's sort of like, it's a plant where if you touch it, it withdraws its leaves a little bit. And if you put anesthetic gas in the environment of that plant, it seems that it stops doing that. I don't know how generalizable it is to other plants, but some of that might be very, very specific. I don't think that response to anesthesia should be the only criterion for consciousness. I think that would be going too far. I'm not aware of any organism that has, of any individual that cannot be anesthetized. Although susceptibility to anesthesia varies. Some people and animals are more or less susceptible. That is partly genetic. But it is a difficult... Yes, I think it is very difficult to cut a line and say up to here is conscious and beyond this is not.
Yeah, not conscious, right? Yeah, based on what basis you're saying that?
A lot of that goes with what philosophers would call intuition. And there is a sense in which, our nervous systems become more complexity of thought and feelings, etc. One might expect that it goes with more complex nervous system. And it's not clear up to which point it breaks down, if it ever breaks down. At the same time, it is, I think, necessary, at least for ethical reasons, to have clear guidelines, right? So it is a difficult job to have to say, could we do research? Would research on any species require ethical approval? Well, in a sense, that's not feasible, right? So we need to find where to cut a line. I think recently, for example, the UK decided to include, if I'm not mistaken, I don't want to spread false information, but I believe that, for example, cephalopods, like octopus, etc., I'm pretty sure that are now considered in the same way as vertebrates. Whereas I think before it was not necessarily the case. It might not be the case in every country. I think that's a good thing. I do think that they're conscious in a similar way. Even though their consciousness might be very different, my expectation is that they are conscious, like some vertebrates. But indeed, I don't know how far that goes. I don't know is there something it's like to be a fly? I think potentially, maybe not a lot of that. But the question of a lot of consciousness, some theories take that as a meaningful question and others do not, right? So we're at a stage, I think the main message maybe that I should convey there is one of, we should be very modest. We should be, especially as scientists and philosophers working in this field, there is a lot of uncertainty and progress is happening very fast. I think that means that we should be very modest and admit that there is a lot of uncertainty and say, this is what I think, but here's my uncertainty, and others will disagree on all of these other positions. So I think sometimes it can be tricky when someone expresses a lot of confidence, maybe because they have a specific theory or because they have some very strongly held belief or intuition. It's not clear where those beliefs and intuitions are coming from.
Yes, thousands of years ago, there was intuition that, Earth is the center of universe, right? And everything spans around our planet. So it's very strong intuition.
Yes, exactly. We have a lot of intuitions as humans, and some of those intuitions are wrong. And I think that's one of the things that philosophy training teaches you very quickly, that sometimes intuitions are good and sometimes they're just misleading. And likewise, psychology teaches you that as well. Sometimes you have a very strongly held belief that something is the case or has happened, and that you can be mistaken. And I think as scientists, our job is to find the truth, but also to remember that we need to be very careful with our statements until they're properly backed up. And especially when many different sensible, smart, well-educated people disagree, as is currently the case about consciousness, I think that is a very clear alarm bell to say nobody should be very confident, because there's equally confident people who are confident on the opposite thing. And we can't all be right. So let's just assume that we really need to know more. So all of this is to say, I do think it's tricky to make decisions about where to cut a line. I don't know if there is any line to be cut. Some people think everything is conscious. That's called panpsychism.
That universe is conscious, right? Like everything has like signs of consciousness.
Now, I don't personally subscribe to that view, but I understand why some of the intuitions would bring you there. Is it possible that all living things are conscious? I think maybe that's more plausible. I don't think a rock has consciousness in any meaningful way, but I understand why some people think that. What about all living things? Maybe. Do you need to be an animal or some form to be conscious? That I don't know. And I want to be clear, I'm very uncertain. We do all have to make pragmatic decisions and respect the regulation of the countries we live in. And I think that is a pragmatic consideration as well. It would be difficult if any research at all had to be constantly ethically vetted, even for working on, say, microscopic worms. But maybe.
Otherwise, we won't do like any progress at all, right? Like we'll just like stuck in this bureaucratic approvals or whatnot.
And I don't think we want that. At the same time, we want to make very, very sure that the research that we do is fully ethical and is, there's very clear cost-benefit analysis that are being run, and we only do it if the benefits outweigh the costs. Very important there. But I think, the message of uncertainty is important, because both philosophers and neuroscientists can express very strong views, especially, in a sense, in today's information age. The opinion of, we're not really sure, but here's our best guess, is not it's easier to sell with a strong opinion than with a more moderate opinion. But I think it's important to express that this is a case where we really have a lot of different opinions and different evidence pointing in different ways.
Speaking of different opinions and being modest, what's your take on consciousness in AI systems? They have lots of data. They also, we might see some signs of synchronicity in neural networks as well, right? So we can't completely say no, they're not conscious. So I'm just don't want to bias you, but I just what's your take?
At that point you were mentioning, we do have, including with myself, a couple of papers looking at synergy in, one of them was in artificial neural networks, and another one that just came out last month was about synergy in LLMs. And we're showing that, like humans, LLMs have parts that are more synergistic, that are doing more interesting computation, and then other parts that are more redundant, that are more supporting inputs and outputs, basically. So that organization seems to be shared across humans and LLMs. At the same time, LLMs are, in many other senses, very different from the architecture of the brain, even excluding the fact that they're not biological. Yes, there's a lot of debate about that. There are some people who are very confident that they are conscious. There are some neuroscientists, for example, who are very confident that they're not. And they say LLMs lack all of these biological properties, and they list them, that we have seen matter. in conscious beings, in conscious biological beings. So a lot of the question hinges on, can something that is not biological be conscious? Some people are strongly convinced that you need biology for consciousness, and that includes some very smart people, even co-authors of mine. I don't think I agree with that view, but I understand a lot of the reasons why people think that. The way I usually think about it, and I'm writing a little paper about that, is the flight analogy. It's you make very, very often the analogy is made between flight in birds and flight in planes, and they happen very differently, but you can still find some of the same principles, for example, and flight evolved independently in different species. Of course, you also have flight in helicopters, and that works by an entirely different principle that nevertheless still lets you suspended in the air, basically. And so I think it's important to be open to this possibility that you can have the same phenomenon, flight, consciousness, potentially implemented in very different systems, some of which might be even not biological. The point is, I'm not sure that there is anything magical about biology, because biology is made of chemistry, which is made of atoms, and all of a sudden you're talking physics. And I could imagine a world where we never use the word biology, and all of that is just physics, right? Which it is, right? But I could imagine a world where we don't make the distinction between biology and non-biology. We all study that as physics, and then this question might not even arise meaningfully. Now, at the same time, being open to the possibility does not mean embracing it or saying, yes, they're definitely conscious, because there are, for example, Rethink Priorities, which is an organization that does a lot of interesting research work. They very recently, I think last month, just put out their, in a sense, it's a survey of, could LLMs be conscious? It's a very prominent question. And they took a very interesting approach, which I like, because it's a bit more in tune with what I was saying earlier about we need to acknowledge our uncertainty. And so they said, you know what, we're going to look at maybe 20 something different theories of consciousness, which is a fair number. And then for each of them, we're going to look at some of the signs that something that is conscious would have to exhibit according to that theory. So, there's a lot of different ones. Intelligence, biosimilarity, being carbon-based is one. Being, how similar is your neural architecture to the real human brain, and so on and so forth. So a lot of different indicators of these theories. And then they ask people to rank LLMs according to these principles. How much, experts, they asked, do you think LLMs exhibit this signal or that signal or that signal? And this was 2024 LLMs. And they also compared that on the exact same benchmark. They compared chickens and humans to try and guess, would this sort of aggregator tool give you the right kind of answers? And what they found was that once you aggregate all of these opinions, humans are definitely conscious, which I think is good news for us, because otherwise the tool will be broken. There's very strong evidence that chickens, according to most of these indicators of most of these theories, should be considered conscious. The evidence about LLMs was against 2024 LLMs being conscious. So the evidence says it's more likely that they're not conscious than that they are conscious, but it's not very strong evidence. So, and it varies by which theories you consider more or less plausible. You could treat them all equally, but some theories are a lot more established, or they have a lot more people believing in them, or they have a lot more evidence. Whereas other theories might be very new, very recent. There's not a lot of evidence. Maybe they're only believed by a small number of people. So there's a lot of problems with that approach. You don't know how to weigh the theories. You don't know which theories to include. But I think that's the right kind of approach. The one way that I would say that we should improve is, rather than asking people's opinions of how brain-like it is, or how much information it integrates, or so on and so forth, it would be good to have some objective measure, some way of being able to measure that, whether that's synergy or something else. How much information does it integrate? Oh, it's more than I expected, or less than I expected. So all of this is to say, I don't have strong opinions on LLM consciousness right now. I think it's interesting, more than my own personal opinion. Maybe it's more interesting to look at this aggregator of different people's opinions across theories that says it looks like they're not, but it's not very strong evidence. And by not very strong, I mean, it's conceivable that it could flip with further refinement later on, and it would change depending on which. Some theories would be more or less movable. Some theories would just not move at all because it's not biological, end of story. Others might be more open to that possibility.
Yeah, I mean, when it comes to human opinion, it's already biased, right? Like, so it's not truly objective. But as you said, like we need some like objective measurement, right?
The problem is that varies by theory, right? So some of them will just preclude it ahead of time, either because it's not biological, or I think integrated information theory has some grounds for saying no, this kind of artificial entity is just in principle not conscious. Other theories are more open to it. But also part of the problem is some theories are specified in a very narrow sense around the human brain.
Yeah.
So they, for example, if your theory is about cortico-thalamical interactions, so interaction between the cortex and the thalamus, in a sense, that's a very powerful theory because the monkey experiment with the thalamic stimulation provides evidence that thalamic interactions with the cortex are very important. So it explains a lot about human and maybe primate or mammalian consciousness. But then you go to the octopus, which doesn't have a thalamocortical system, and all of a sudden your theory, it's not clear what your theory even has to say, let alone in a computer. Other theories are a lot more general, and it's not clear how to put them on an equal footing, in a sense.
I personally bias that it might become conscious.
I think, yes, that could be one path that one could see for that to happen, right? It could be the level of, maybe not necessarily just the amount of data that you have, maybe the complexity of the architecture that you need in order to process those data, and the kind of maybe information integration that can happen by virtue of those two. That might be enough, and that depends on what theory. I want to caution against equating synergy with consciousness, just for two reasons. One is a slightly more technical reason, which is that synergy or this integrated information, which is what we actually looked at in the recent paper, it can arise from many different kinds of interactions. And some of them synergy, some of them not synergy. And all they were saying there is when you stop being able to process information, there's less synergy. In a sense, that doesn't have to be about consciousness, right? It's just that the organism is separated from the environment, is not processing information anymore. And that might be enough to lose the synergy, even though maybe you could still be conscious in such a scenario. So they needn't be identical. Something like integrated information theory would push for a stronger identity between the two. I think of synergy as an interesting, as a marker of information processing richness, but not necessarily, possibly, but not necessarily identical with consciousness. But so that's just one view where even the same data could be interpreted differently by different theoretical stances, depending on how closely you equate integration with consciousness. Now, the other point is it's possible that even just more complexity might not bring more consciousness, right? So some theories would say, why do you expect that just as you scale something up, something fundamentally different happens? So that, is there going to be some emergent behavior at a particular scale or not? It's not obvious either way. I think some theories would say you can't have something different by just having more. Some others would say, no, more can be different. And these are theories about emergence in behavior. We have seen that the capacity of LLMs has really increased as they increased in size. And that's been very interesting. It's not clear whether that comes with whether you would need a fundamentally different architecture for consciousness. So again, different theories there will pull in different directions based on their intuitions. And so again, it's this message of, I think I'm not in the camp that thinks in principle they cannot be, but I think we need to be open to both possibilities. It's important that I think both camps should recognize that they could be wrong. I think it's very dangerous when, especially in science, but also in philosophy, when someone becomes dogmatic and just starts saying, I couldn't possibly be wrong. I think in science, if there is one certain, is that you're very likely to be wrong a lot of the time. So that's where I'm coming from. I agree that the embodiment is, and many think, could be a path that makes that more likely. If it's not just about scaling up the amount of data that you have, but also scaling up the ability of data to the ability of the system to interact multimodally with the environment, for example, through embodiment. Many think that increases the chances of something, in a sense, interesting happening later on. Other theories would say that just still not biological, so it's still not possible. I'm curious to see how that plays out effectively. But the one thing I would say about that is, for a long time there was this idea, especially among some philosophers, that not even chimps or monkeys could be conscious, that only humans are conscious because only humans have language. I do not agree with that view. My work speaks for the fact that I don't agree with that view, but many people thought that there was something almost magical about language and compositionality of language, and that no other species has it, and so no other species has
But now LLMs, they speak like hundreds of languages, right?
I think the one thing I think is guaranteed that we got out of LLMs, if nothing else, is that they are proof that something non-biological.
But there is no magic in language.
Effectively, yes. You can have language from a completely different way. It has not evolved in LLMs. It is not supported by a biological brain in any meaningful sense. And so all of a sudden, the one thing that we thought, that some thought really had to go with consciousness, all of a sudden we had to decide which, like, they came decoupled. And I think that's really interesting. I think a lot of interesting discovery in science happens when two things that we always thought would go together become decoupled. And that LLM have been very, very useful to us for that, because now we have to make a real judgment call. And those philosophers would have to say either LLMs are conscious or I was wrong. And I think some people have chosen each path.
Another thing I wanted to cover with you, I don't know if how much is it in your sort of research area, the question of and it's also related to our conversation about AI, the question of self-identity. When you put someone to anesthesia, like human, right? It doesn't mean that they lose their self-identity when they come back. They still have their memories, their world model they formed. I don't know what else contributes to so-called self-identity. And I'm wondering, is there any phenomena in that despite that someone loses its consciousness, it still maintains that self-image, I would say? And then I will move to kind of connecting it to self-identity in AI.
My work touches on that only a bit tangentially. In a sense, you could say it's not so surprising, because what I don't think happens is that the self, as in the person, remains aware of their own self even as they are unconscious. That, I think, is in a sense a contradiction, because unconscious means aware of nothing. Otherwise, they're not fully unconscious. So the way I think of it is that when they come back, their self is, in effect, made by their memories and their patterns of behavior, etc. And so when they come back from unconsciousness, all of those memories and patterns of behavior, they're not erased from the brain by anesthesia. They're just temporarily suppressed, and so they come back. So it's like, an impression that something leaves on, say, a pillow, right? Leave your head on a pillow, it leaves an impression, and that's still there. So that's what I would mean by it's not maybe that surprising that the memories are there, because your brain is not scrambled, it's just temporarily off. Not much different from, for example, your computer being on standby. The memories are still there, everything is still there, but just not currently active in that sense. What does happen is, in a sense, the reverse, where you have cases where the sense of self goes away, but the person is still conscious. That happens, for example, with some psychedelics, where one of the strong, in a way, strong predictions of one of the most robust effects of psychedelics can be this ego dissolution, this feeling of, as they say, merging with the universe.
Yeah, but you still have your memory, right? You're merging with universe, but you're still remember your past, some facts about yourself if you're asked, even under that psychedelic, right?
I don't recall seeing reports of that, but I would assume that that's the case. Yes. So in a sense, somehow they're still not. The way I would describe it is perhaps you still are a self, you still are the person that you are, but you're temporarily lost knowledge of that, or the feeling of that, if you will.
Yeah, I think like feeling maybe more.
Yeah, the sense of self, perhaps, more than being a self.
Do you think something like that could be recreated in AI system? That sense of self?
LLMs, when you talk with them, they will use the word I, etc., and they will, in a sense, remember some previous conversations, etc. I don't think that's sufficient for a sense of self. That seems a very minimalistic. It looks like it, but I don't think it's sufficient. But I think figuring out what makes a sense of self, I think that might be even more difficult than figuring out what makes something conscious. On account of, it looks like you could be conscious without having a sense of self. And so sense of self is something that might be even more complicated. And we had some thoughts about that a while back. We wrote a paper about synergy and consciousness and the self. And we know, for example, which parts of the brain seem to be affected when you lose your sense of self. Those seem to be those same parts of the brain where you have a lot of synergy. There might be something about being a system that conveys information synergistically and being a unified system. In a way, this idea of synergy and integrated information, it grew out of the idea that sometimes the whole can be greater than the sum of the parts. And when that happens, then that's a really integrated system. That's a system that, it's not just a collection of parts, but it's something else. And so you could say maybe that's the minimum requirement for something to be a self, that it needs to have synergy so that it can be something more than the sum of its parts, a non-zero amount or a non-trivial amount of synergy. So that's possible. That could be one way. I suspect it might take more, but at least that could be it might be a necessary but not sufficient condition, for example. But I don't have strong evidence that it's necessary. We were conjecturing in that paper just based on anatomical correspondences and the meaning of synergy.
If we make a summary of your take on AI consciousness, as I understand, you don't think we should be too attached to biology and basically be open-minded that consciousness can arise in AI systems as well, and maybe it's already there to some extent, or will be there once they're more.
I don't currently think it is there. I broadly align myself with that survey saying it's more likely than not that it isn't there. But indeed, I don't think we should be completely attached to biology. And so I think we should be open to the possibility of consciousness in a non-biological entity, even though it currently doesn't seem to be there at present. But I think being open-minded is the most important method. There's just so much uncertainty that it's taking any strong position. I wouldn't feel comfortable taking any strong position there, either for or against.